All right, Genesis chapter 4, once again. You probably still have your Bibles there open to it, don't you? Where is Abel thy brother? The Lord inquired of Cain. Now, the Lord never asks the question because he does not know the answer. He knows all of the answers, doesn't he? But he asked the question because he knew that it was important for Cain to face up to the neglect of his responsibility to be his brother Abel's keeper. Cain's response reveals an attitude of rejection of the responsibility for the whereabouts or the welfare of Abel. Cain's response concerning this matter of where Abel was reveals an attitude that led to the death of one son and the lifelong departure of another son from the family of Adam and Eve. Not only a departure, in Cain's case, from family, but a departure from the Lord. You see, from the very beginning, the home and the family have experienced the stress of disagreement. When Cain brought an offering unto the Lord, and Abel brought an offering unto the Lord, and the Lord had respect unto Abel's offering and to Abel, and did not respect Cain and his offering, there was a disagreement between God and Cain. But it was also a disagreement between Cain and Abel, and between Cain and Adam, and Cain and Eve. It was a disagreement that began this way in his relationship with his Creator, but then it immediately spilled over to his relationship this way. Now, at that very moment in history, the problem was very solvable. Disagreements are inevitable in life. But had Cain resolved this disagreement biblically, then he would have brought the right offering, and we wouldn't be reading any of this. History would have been completely different. How then you and I deal with disagreements in our family is extremely important. You see, Cain should have let God be the arbitrator and God's word, the final word, in his disagreement with the Lord and with his family. Whenever you and I decide that we are not going to submit ourselves to God's way in any disagreement, we're on our way to division and eventual divorce, eventual departure, in this case, the death of a man, Cain's brother Abel. Cain's dispute with the Lord led to division in his family, death, and a departure. His willingness to disappoint God and his parents and to deny knowledge of the whereabouts of his brother, then to murder his brother and to depart from the presence of the Lord and his family are symptoms of an attitude that is expressed in Cain's question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Obviously, keeping his family together was not important to Cain, but it should have been of the paramount importance to him. Cain's attitude is at the heart of the serious breakdown of this home and family, and it is at the heart of the breakdown of homes and families even today. When he said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" that perspective, denying his responsibility as his brother's keeper, is still responsible for the division that happens in homes and families. And not just homes and families, but it happens anywhere you have people relating with other people, and particularly people that are in authority and people that are under their authority. Division is inevitable, but how we handle, disagreement is inevitable. Division is not. if two people will agree, even to disagree, but to submit themselves to God's arbitration in the matter, in any matter, they can have peace and harmony and serenity and security in their home. Now, Cain's attitude, as expressed here, is not an attitude that you and I are likely to hear expressed verbally, because, after all, we don't listen in on each other's conversations with the Lord. But when this attitude prevails in an individual's life, whether it be my own or a family member or somebody that I have a mutual accountability and responsibility for, and along with, whenever that happens, there are certain symptoms that signal the presence of this kind of an attitude. Am I my brother's keeper? And I'd like to talk to you about those symptoms this morning, because I believe it's God's sacred design and plan that our homes and families be places of serenity and security. A place where, yes, we disagree, but when we disagree, we resolve our disagreements scripturally. We who are appalled at the spirit we see in Cain and in those who behave like Cain must also diligently guard against his point of view becoming our position, because disagreements will always result in division except for biblical intervention. Now, as I mentioned before, this is applicable to our families, but really in all human relationships. My daughter Jenny just returned from being in Cleveland, Georgia, between Atlanta and Greenville, South Carolina, in the mountains. Pastor King and Mrs. King and their family serve the Lord in an independent Baptist church there where he's pastoring. It's a wonderful blessing. So Jenny went down there last week, spent a few days with them, and she was telling that the distance between where they live, I think she said about 8 miles from church. And I had the numbers confused at the 8:30 service, but she said 17 Baptist churches just in that one stretch of road between where they live and where they go to church. 17. After the early service this morning, a couple came up to me and said they were familiar with a church in the south that went through a split, and so they took whatever the name of the church was, and it was called such and such Baptist Church number 1, and then such and such Baptist Church number 2, and they were 1 mile apart. Now, do you think God was a part of starting 17 independent Baptist churches in an 8-mile stretch of highway in those mountains? Or do you think that there were some people in the church that had disagreements with one another and were not willing to submit to the arbitration of God and His Word and resolve those problems, and as a result, division took place? Now, let me preface what I'm going to talk to you about both this morning and this evening on this matter of keeping our families together by saying this. There is an inevitability that sold-out dedicated Christianity and heathenism or carnal Christianity will not mix any more than oil and water. When Jesus came, He said, from the get-go, from His beginning of His public ministry, He said, I'm going to be like a sword in some families. So there is an inevitability that there will be a disagreement that cannot be resolved because of the hardness of someone's heart and their unwillingness to submit. Then division is inevitable. Now, they may still live under the same roof if we apply it to the home. They may still live under the same roof, but the relationship is not what God intended it to be, and it certainly is not what they were anticipating it to be when they got married. But it's devolved into that as a result of disagreements that have not been resolved biblically, and that may be because one says, I'm not going to submit to that. I'm not going to do that. I remember visiting one of our church members, a lady in jail. I was surprised she had been arrested. She said, I'm here because of you. And I said, what? She said, yes. She said, I'm here because of you. I said, no, you're not. You're here because you you drove a getaway car for your husband in a robbery. She said, yeah, that's what I mean. You preached, wives, submit yourselves unto your husbands. So I was just doing what he told me to do. Now, that was crazy thinking. God would never tell her husband to, go rob a store. Would he? No, of course he wouldn't. So there is an inevitable division that does occur at times in relationships that cannot or will not be reconciled because of the hardness of people's hearts. However, every one of us need to avoid the attitude that we see in Cain's response to God's inquiry when he said, am I my brother's keeper? His attitude is being revealed. And though we were not there and could not listen to the tenor of his voice and how he said what he said, I can tell you that there are signals here, or there are ways that you can see that Cain was not interested at all in meeting his responsibilities to his family. And that's what I want to talk to you about. These signals or symptoms of this attitude. Number one is dishonesty. Now, when God said to Cain, where is your brother Abel? Cain said, I know not. Now, in some places, that might be true. Someone may not know the whereabouts of their brother, but that was not true for Cain, because he left his brother lifeless. Abel wasn't going anywhere. Well, Abel did go somewhere. He went to paradise, but his body was right where it had been buried or hidden in some way, or where it was laying after he had killed his brother. Now, this was a bold-faced lie, straight up. Now, you may not know whether somebody's intentionally saying, I don't really care about my family responsibilities. I'm not interested in having any kind of responsibility for the whereabouts or the welfare of my family. You may meet somebody like that. It's highly unlikely they're going to come straight out and tell you that. But I can tell you this. One of the symptoms of this attitude is a willingness to be dishonest. One of the strongest statements made in the New Testament is in the book of Hebrews, chapter number 13, where the Bible says, willing to live honestly. And what an affront and an insult to lie straight up to God. A man that'll just lie straight up to God, he's willing to do anything. Now, you may say, well, I really care about my family, and I take my keeping of my family seriously. Do you really? Well, then let me ask you this. Are you living honestly with God? Are you living honestly with your spouse? Are you living honestly with your parents? Are you living honestly with your brothers and sisters? If you're not, if you're dishonest, then you're like Cain. And we may not hear you say it, but we know that that's true, because wherever you see dishonesty, you'll find this attitude that we see in Cain. Am I my brother's keeper? Cain was obviously insincere in answering God's question. Sincere people are committed to telling the truth. And honesty, by the way, is me telling you the truth about me. It is not necessarily you telling me the truth about me. Oftentimes we're just, I just had to just honestly say it. Those people usually, they have a lot of things they ought to say, but it ought to be confession of their own dishonesty. It ought to be their own confession instead of trying to confess everybody else's sins. He was willing to lie straight up to God. He was insincere. His answer insinuated an attitude that he didn't consider himself one iota responsible for the whereabouts nor the welfare of Abel. Now, if anyone deserves our sincere and honest and respectful response to his questions, is it not God? And furthermore, is it not our family? Unfortunately, much dishonesty in children is a mirror of dishonesty between parents. Keeping our families together, we have to identify, first and foremost in ourselves, any tendency towards this attitude that we see in Cain, absolving himself of any responsibility for his family and their success. Cain revealed this by his dishonesty. Secondly, Cain revealed this by his disrespect. His disrespect for God and his authority, in fact, or anyone in authority. You know, under certain circumstances, the question may have been, and could be even sincerely asked. He could say, am I my brother's keeper? And you may meet people that really they have no conscious responsibility for their siblings, for, as this was the case here, was Cain and Abel. You may meet somebody and honestly they don't know by virtue of conscience the responsibility that we have to our family members. But that certainly was not the case for Cain. Cain wasn't asking this question innocently. It was not an honest inquiry. Am I my brother's keeper? It was a statement of rebellion. It was an insult to God. It showed great disrespect for him to talk to the Lord that way. And can I say to you that as our children grow older and we wonder, where is our family going? One of the clues to a division that's coming into your family is disrespect for people in authority. And now, and you see it in a husband not respecting his wife. A husband does not respect his wife by calling her the old lady. He does not use words of female dogs and call his wife those kind of words. And the children in your home, when they're real little, you think, man, this is great, and it is. But can I tell you, they're not going to stay little forever. You say, I can control them, and I know what's going on, and our family's going to stay together forever. Well, if your family stays together forever, then I'll tell you what, you're an unusual family, because most families don't. Here's a mom and a daddy, and one son's dead, and another one departs and never contacts them again. For how many years? 800 years? It was so solvable. At that moment when there was a disagreement, if all parties involved would have just simply said, hey, let's let God settle this dispute. What does God say? And then we'll just do what God says. And you know what? Problem solved. But instead, Cain shirked his responsibility. And he demonstrated that by his blatant disrespect for God, disrespect for his parents, disrespect for his brother Abel. This was an indication that Cain was not interested in being involved in keeping his family together. Number 3, there's another symptom of this kind of an attitude. And I want you to see that Cain's question, it reveals that he was rejecting God's definition of a family. If you gain your idea of a family from Oprah Winfrey or Ellen DeGeneres, you're going to be a crazy mixed up. We've already seen this established in the book of Genesis. When he said, am I my brother's keeper, he wasn't talking about in the generic sense of humanity. It wasn't a metaphor for the human family. No, he was talking about somebody that he was physically, literally, biologically related to. You know, persons to whom we are related biologically or legally, we call them relatives. The word relative is a part of the same word family of relation, which is a part of the word family of relationship. He said, where is your brother Abel? He said, am I my brother's keeper? He knew that this was not, just another human being, but this was somebody that God had placed into his life. You see, do you know who brought Abel into Cain's life? God did. Do you know who brought Cain into the home of Adam and Eve? God did. For Cain to say, you know what, my parents are not important to me. I don't care about their whereabouts, and I don't care about their welfare, is to cop an attitude like Cain. If anyone ought to care about their parents, it ought to be Christian people. I have in a situation with a family now, an older family member, not my family, but a family that I know well, and the older family member is living way below poverty level, while their children live very, very prosperously. And they expect their mother to live on a little bit of subsistence from Social Security and the retirement from a small pension left to her by their deceased father. Therein, their mother lives in a shanty of a house, while they live in a mansion of a house. My friend, that is a Cain attitude. That is saying, I'm not my brother's keeper, I'm not my mother's. My friend, you do have a biblical responsibility to the whereabouts and the welfare of our family, your family. And I've got one for mine. Family is a man. It's a man who's a son, and then he may become a husband. But even if he doesn't become a husband, he's still a son, makes him a part of a family. He may become a husband and then a father and a grandfather. Maybe he'll live old enough, and hope I do, to be a great-grandfather. The woman may become a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a great-grandmother. There are children. There are boys and there are girls. There are brothers and there are sisters. And God made these decisions, bringing these people into our lives. Then there are cousins, and then there are aunts, and then there are uncles. And the whereabouts and the welfare of our immediate family. When Cain said, am I my brother's keeping? He full well understood what was being meant by God's query, God's question, but he was rejecting his responsibility to his family. Now, does that make you feel uncomfortable this morning? If it does, that is God revealing to you a spirit of Cain in your life. You say, well, they've left, and I don't know other than praying for some that you can do anything else, but I don't mean to detract at all from the praying for them. You know, this morning when I came to the office early, later on, my wife texted me. Justin, look up here. My wife texted me, and she said that Uncle Louis died this morning. Now, my wife's Uncle Louis is part of the Nacken family, part of my wife's mother's family. One of 13 children. Uncle Louis is probably 80 years of age, maybe beyond. He's probably in his 80s. And my wife texted me this morning because her aunt called, because her 80-plus-year-old uncle went home to be with the Lord this morning. Now you say, well, what's the significance of that? The significance is that's a demonstration of our commitment to family. Old so-and-so, yeah, what do you look like? Yeah, you know, I hadn't seen him in 40 or 50 years. Why? You know, we'd say, I really care about family, and I think I want to keep our family together. Do we really? Or do we just let them go and never... Well, you know, they ought to call. Well, maybe we ought to call. You know, they ought to visit. Well, maybe we ought to visit. Yeah. When Diane's mother moved here after her brother David died, and actually since her dad died when Diane was, I think, 18 years of age or 19, he died at only 53 years of age. Diane's mother was as close, probably honestly closer to me than my own mother, in the sense of just my proximity. And my mother had my dad to take care of her, but my mother-in-law was a widow. And you know, all those years, we determined as a family that my mother-in-law would never want. So as long as she can drive, Diane, I'll make sure she has a nice car and a safe car. I'm going to make sure she lives in a very nice place as long as she can live on her own. And I'll tell you, once they're gone, it's a wonderful thing. It's in your conscience to be able to say, you know what, I loved my mother-in-law. And nobody else except for our own family. But I'll tell you, it's a testimony. You know. And when her mother was dying, my wife was there. She slept beside her mother while her mother went in that valley of the shadow of death. Held close to her mother. Right there when she took her last breath. See? You know, a lot of people, they die alone. Nobody shows up for a funeral. They live their last years way below where they could and should. But these are all consequences of families that, when they disagree, divide. And it prevailed in this very first family. You know, undoubtedly Cain understood the definition of a family. Number 4, Cain's question reveals that he also understood what it meant to be a keeper. And you know, I think it's a wrong thing that Cain rejected being a keeper. He said, am I my brother's keeper? In other words, I'm not willing to fulfill that responsibility. But he understood it. Now, the word keeper in the Bible, you've already met it in Genesis. You met it in chapter number 2, verse number 15, when God put Adam in a garden, and he said to Adam, he said, now I want you to dress it. He said, go to work. And he said, you know, plant flowers and build a house, take care of all these things. And then he said, but I want you to keep it also. Same word. When Cain said, am I my brother's keeper? His father was given the responsibility of being the keeper of his home. And you know, the word keeper, it comes from a word in the Hebrew, the Old Testament. It comes from a word of a thorn bush. Now what they would do, they didn't have electric fences like we use today to keep unsavory people out or wild animals out of our property. But back then they surrounded their where they keep their sheep, the sheepfolds, and they surrounded their homes with these thorn bushes. It's the word keeper. They planted keepers. They were so thickly entwined that there was no way even the smallest animal, even a little fox, couldn't get through to the vineyard if they had the keepers there. Now, God said to Adam, he said, now listen, that's what you need to be to your home. You need to protect your family. This is the same word that was used in chapter number 3 when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, and there was a tree in the garden, a tree of life, and God did not want Adam and Eve partaking of that tree of life. Had they done so, they would have been doomed to live forever. Can you imagine getting old and suffering and all the pains of things breaking down but never being able to die? Can you imagine the guilt and the weight and all of that? So God said he put cherubims to keep the way to the tree of life. In other words, they were there to protect Adam and Eve from something that would be destructive. And now Cain says, you know, God, I'm not willing to be a protector to my brother Abel. I don't want to assume that responsibility. A keeper was a word used, a keep was a word used in Genesis 17 and other places of covenants. When a covenant was made, an agreement between people, it was kept. And the word kept is the same word. It means it was an agreement of responsibility. And what I'm simply saying is that our families, we keep them together by a mutual accountability and responsibility for the whereabouts and the welfare of one another. And we make our decisions alert to what we're doing and what they're doing and how all that fits in with God's plan for our lives and for our family. In the New Testament, the Bible, Titus 2:5, says that the Christian wife is to be a keeper at home. She is to be a guard of the home. You know, our own flesh, we need to be alert to to inroads within our flesh that will lead us away from God. There are influences in the world in which we live that we have to be alert to. And then there's the devil himself. When you have a little child and you think, oh, this is wonderful, but as that child grows, we have a responsibility to guard that child and to make sure we know about their whereabouts. And I'm not talking about what bedroom they sleep in. I'm talking about what's going on inside of here. What's going on inside of here? What's going on in their inside life? And neglect of that responsibility, I'll get to more to that tonight in a practical way, but neglect of that responsibility will be so damaging and destructive. Can I tell you that you'll never experience making enough money to substitute for having harmony and serenity and peace in your family. You'll never get to do enough things that are, and I've had wonderful opportunities, but can I tell you, it all pales in comparison to being able to go to 11779 Cardinal Lane and enjoy the peace and serenity of relationships with people that are right with God and right with one another. And when disagreements come up, they've got to be dealt with, but when somebody in the family decides to be dishonest, their trouble's on its way. When somebody becomes disrespectful, when somebody says, you know what, I'm not good. Oftentimes in a family, a sibling will know what mom and dad don't know. You'll know what your sister or brother are up to. And you decide to hide that when you know it's wrong? Now, it's much more complicated today. Because when I was a kid, if I wanted to call a girl on the telephone, now, I never did that, of course. That was a lie. Sorry. But to call a girl on the telephone, I had to go to the kitchen. Now, the kitchen is a very popular place in our home when I was a kid. Obviously. I liked the kitchen. So did my dad and the family. And you went to the wall and they had this thing on the wall, box. And it had numbers on it. And you picked up a receiver and you put it to your ear and it had a cord to it. And no, I didn't have to go to an operator, so there, all right? I'm not that old. But it was pretty obvious to anybody that was around. It was only a 900 square foot house, and so it wasn't like you could hide somewhere. But now you can. Huh. But if we're not keepers, if we're not on guard, when those temptations come, and if we shirk our responsibility, it'll lead to division, lead to disaster. It's a big job. I'm glad that when I was a child, I had the privilege of growing up in a home where my dad, he worked at the sanitation department. And but he also was in the FBI. I'm very thankful for that. He was in the Father's Bureau of Investigation. And my dad checked up on me. And I'm glad he did. One day the contest broke between me just trying to become sneakier and just accepting God's word, God's plan. I remember when I was about maybe 13 or 14, Pastor Hayes, I came in and Dad and Mom were there in the kitchen, and Barbara and Marcia and Richard were not there. And my dad said, "Sit down at the table, Paul." Boy, I knew that Dan, something's up. So I sat down, and my dad went over to there's a cupboard above the stove. My dad opened up a door, and he reached up in there, and he pulled something out that he'd had up there, and he brought it over, and he put it on the table, and it was a little paperback novel. That's not the novel that anybody should read. My dad said, "Son, how'd this get in your bedroom?" Now, you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, how'd you find it? They had a drop ceiling in my bedroom. You know what a drop ceiling is? You know, my dad went down there with a flashlight, lifted the ceilings, took the flashlight, and went around like this. Found that look. I found out my mother would go down and she'd take the mattress between the mattress and the box spring. She'd lift it up and look at it. She'd look under it. You say, "Oh, that's my private business." No, that's just parents being good parents. You know, if somebody doesn't want any measure of accountability, and they're just being dishonest, they start getting disrespectful, you can just know you're dealing with something there. Somebody's not being real. And you're on your way. You're on your way. And it's a call. It's to deal with it. I've wondered, in church ministries, how much if people would have just been willing to be accountable, how many issues could have been resolved and you wouldn't have a split. Wouldn't have the testimony of the Lord destroyed or hurt, hindered. And how many homes we could salvage, and really not just salvage, but have a great home and family if everybody would just take our responsibilities seriously. And certainly not follow the way of Cain and say, am I my brother's keeper?